Okay, folks, welcome to week 13 of Supernatural Folklore. This is the week that we start talking about aliens. A couple of housekeeping items first. There is a lecture by Dr. Erica Brady, who will be talking about ethnomusicology, Kentucky. So that's folk music. And she will be talking about Kentucky's contributions to folk music. Um, that lecture will be Thursday night, 11/17 at 5:30 at the Kentucky Museum. If you're going to attend that lecture, please take your ID with you so that you can swipe. It's going to be a swipeable event, and I will get the attendance for that. And also, if you're there, I'm planning on being there, so stop by and say hi. I'd love to meet you. Um, the other piece that I want to talk about is the research paper. I've given feedbacks on every draft and outline that I received, and I'm available for questions about that feedback. If you didn't understand what I was saying to you, you have questions about whether or not an article is appropriate, you're not sure how to clear up whatever issue I mentioned to you, please ask me. I'm happy to clarify anything that you want clarified. I'm also going to suggest that you make an appointment with the Writing Center. They can help you with things like clearly differentiating between your source material and your own ideas. That was a comment that I made on several papers. Um, I expect you to summarize your sources to some degree, and what I want you to do is to indicate where that summarization begins and where it ends, and I want you to make sure that it's clear that that's from another source, and then that your own ideas are clearly delineated. If you are not sure how to do that, you're welcome to ask me. Um, if you would prefer to go to the Writing Center on campus, I certainly advocate going. They can help you with lots of things. Um, they can help you to organize your paper. They can help you to do that citation that can often be so difficult. If you need advice on using whatever style you're using, whether that's APA, MLA, or something else, they can give you advice on that. So I certainly advocate the use of the Writing Center. I will tell you that I taught writing for a great many years, so I feel fairly confident in giving you feedback and kind of helping you with some of those issues. Um, and I'm kind of picky about writing, so um, make sure that it's proofread. Um, make sure that you are doing your citation and things like that. All right, so let's dive into UFO experiences and aliens. The first article that we're going to talk about is The Saucer Full of Secrets, an interdisciplinary analysis of UFO experiences by Dewan. Dewan here is advocating for a multidisciplinary approach to discussing and analyzing UFO narratives because they are complex and they fall into different realms of expertise. So his thesis here is that because UFO narratives are so common, there are a lot of different fields that have expertise that could be applicable to discussion of these narratives. Right? So, the first thing that he points out is that we don't have to prove or disprove the existence of UFOs in order to discuss the experiences that people report. Um, what is important, according to Dewan, is that something out of the ordinary happened to these people, and what they believe happened was that they saw a UFO. And sometimes people have trouble with this. They're like, I don't believe in UFOs. There's no way they could have seen a UFO. But that's not helpful because the person believes they saw a UFO. So you don't necessarily have to believe it, but you should believe that they believe it. Um, Dewan also points out that seeing strange lights in the sky is a cross cultural phenomenon. And as with other core experiences, there are elements of the experience that seem the same no matter what culture we're talking about. And then there are elements of the experience that are different. and those are determined by the amount of cultural knowledge that a person has. Core supernatural experiences are experiences that are found in many different cultures, not just, good old USA American culture. One of those core experiences is a phenomenon called old hag experiences. It's sometimes called sleep paralysis if we're talking about a medical explanation. In Hmong culture, I think it's called Dab Song. But it is the experience of being asleep and then becoming conscious and not being able to breathe. And particularly to see usually an old woman sitting on your chest, pressing on you, so that you cannot breathe. This has happened. This has been reported since forever. In the Middle Ages, it was called being witch rid. And so the belief was that a witch would enter your room, or the spirit of a witch would enter your room, and then she would be sucking the life force out of you, or sucking the breath out of you, or something like that. So this old hag experience has happened in a lot of different cultures. In particularly Hmong culture, it's people who experience it often hear a sound, like feet walking across a grass mat. And remember that those mats would have been common in their homes. So there's that piece of it that's a little different in Hmong culture than in, um, say, American culture. Um, these kind of stories are sometimes related to succubi or incubi stories, but usually the succubi or incubi stories have a sexual component to them, whereas old hag experiences are more about fear and about that inability to breathe. Um, so those types of experiences are also called core experiences because they happen in a lot of different cultures. And while there may be differences in stories across the cultures, there are very minimal differences in the stories within the culture. And that's very interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Um, so Dewan goes on to say that there has been exceptional growth and popularity of UFO phenomena in America in the last 50 years. Wonder why that is. I would probably say it's been longer than that. It's probably been since the 1940s when it was reported that alien an alien spacecraft landed in Roswell. And since that point, we've had people that have been fascinated with this idea of spaceships and UFOs and aliens landing on Earth. Um, that that is evident if you look at our media. There's a reason that The X Files was a really, really popular show in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, Dewan also says that we should, at least in part, take an experience centered look at the phenomena to understand it. So he discusses these events as core experiences, and he uses that old hag experience in the article. There are other core experiences, and often with these core experiences, like I said, there are certain elements that exist regardless of the culture, but there are perceptions and interpretations that are different from culture to culture, and that the variation tends to be minimal within a culture when the stories are told. So, in the case of the 3 UFO experience narratives that Dewan discusses, he says there was no doubt that something strange happened, and that each of the people who saw whatever happened interpreted it in ways that are the same as other people and are slightly different from others and from each other. He says this can be because the experiences happened at different times, but it can also be because there are certain, he calls them schemas in place, which those are like mind shortcuts. It's kind of the way schemas are described. And these are related to cultural understandings and help us fill in blanks. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later. when we talk about the study that I had you to read for this week. But these schemas are sort of like grammars. Um, they help us fill in gaps. So if I gave you three words and there was a letter missing from each word, right? It was CH blank CKEN. It's the first word. And the second word is NOO blank LE. And the last word is SO blank P. Now, most people, if they looked at those words, they would say, oh, it's chicken noodle soup, right? Chicken noodle soup is something that we're all familiar with. Um, most Americans have had chicken noodle soup at one time, unless you were raised a vegan. Um, you know, but we know what chicken noodle soup is. We're really familiar with it. But that last word, SO blank P, could be another word. That word could be soap. But most of us, because we're seeing it with chicken and noodle, which we can fill in pretty easily, we're going to guess that it's soup because we're familiar with that schema. So schemas are kind of like mind shortcuts to help us make sense of things. So Dewan is saying that these cultural motifs are present in stories to help the person make sense of what happened. And people interpret events consistently with similar events that they have experienced or heard of. All right. Dewan also points out that the meaning of these events isn't always constructed immediately. It may be reconstructed over time. So something may happen, you may see something that's odd, but you don't really assign a meaning to it until you're thinking about it later, and then you may assign more meaning to it. And so I think the only story that I really have that maybe will illustrate this is I'll give you this example, and maybe it'll help it make sense. One morning, I was going out. The house that I lived in was in the middle of a cow pasture. And the cow pasture was owned by my uncle, and he had cows in the cow pasture. So I had this really long driveway. It was like a quarter of a mile long. And I was driving down the driveway, and I saw a dog walking across the field. And it was early in the morning. And seeing a dog in a cow pasture is, for a lot of rural folks, a bit concerning. But I looked at this dog and I was like, oh, there's a dog in the pasture, right? And I continue driving down and I make my turn and you turn out of the driveway and I'm heading to, wherever I was going. And it occurred to me, like, I was thinking back on this dog in the cow pasture, and I was like, that was a very odd looking dog. It didn't look like any dog that I had seen before. But it was definitely a dog, right? Like, it was definitely a canine, we'll put it that way. And it had a shaggy coat, and it had four legs, and it had a tail, and it had a snout. It looked like a dog, right? But it didn't look like a dog. There was something different about this dog and the way that this dog moved. And so in my head, I'm trying to figure out what it is about this dog that is not a dog. And it took me a few minutes to figure it out because I'd never seen one during the day out in the open before, but it was a coyote, which looks very similar to a dog, but it didn't move like a dog, and it didn't it didn't have a coat like a dog. There were distinct differences that my mind registered, but it had to puzzle out later. All right. So events may not always be constructed immediately. It may take us a little time to construct what we think happened to us. So in the case that Dewan is examining, he talks about three family members. And all three of them had limited amounts of UFO events before they had whatever this experience was that they had. But all of them drew from UFO tradition or other stories about UFOs in their interpretation of the events. And their stories seem to validate other stories of UFO phenomena. So, shared core elements of UFO experiences often involve, according to Dewan, one, this experience is not it's not sought out by witnesses. Like, people don't go out wanting to see a UFO most of the time. Um, these events occur randomly, although they do perhaps occur in waves. All right. So you may have several people in an area that may see something and they may all interpret that as being a UFO experience. So it may happen in waves, but it it's still random. Um, Usually these experiences all occur at night. There are a variety of colors, shapes, and sizes of craft that are seen. They can be elliptical, they can be cigar shaped, or they can appear triangular to observers. Um, but usually, always, these craft have really strange or impossible maneuvers and accelerations. I mean, most of us are pretty accustomed to seeing things in like airplanes in the sky. Like, we know how airplanes look when they're in the sky. Um, but these particular craft will often hover silently over an area. They may dart around the sky in a way that we don't associate with aircraft at all. They may hover and then like immediately accelerate off, which is not how aircraft normally behave. Um, so these kinds of strange maneuverings are often associated with UFO experiences. And there's also usually a lack of noise associated with the anomaly. Like, we're used to, if a plane is flying overhead and it's flying close enough, you hear that. Um, you know, if you are outside when a helicopter is flying over, or even if you're inside when a helicopter is flying over, you can usually hear those things. So there's a lack of noise that's associated with these particular aircraft, if that's what we want to call them. That there's usually a core kind of element of an UFO story. Um, so Dewan's question here kind of is, are the similarities in the observations that these the similarity in the stories that these three family members tell due to the family processing their perception to fit a shared UFO schema, or are they witnessing this same event and providing similar accounts? Right. And so on 195, Dewan says both of these things are probably true. In this case, it doesn't have to be one or the other. He says that what he ultimately wants is for different disciplines to be able to come together and contribute something to the study of these experiences. He wants psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, folklorists. He says that there are all kinds of different disciplines that can contribute to the study of these experiences. And so that's ultimately what he's after. Um, you know, I guess the thesis here is he doesn't want these stories to be disregarded because people don't believe in UFO experiences. That's sort of beside the point here. The people that have them believe that they have them, and that makes them real enough that he feels like we should have a multidisciplinary approach to looking at what happens. And so that's the Dewan article. And then I want to move on to the study that I had you to read, which was probably very dry, unless you are in a scientific field and you read lots of studies. This probably wasn't your favorite thing that you ever read, but I think that it is useful here. And that one is called Round Trip to Hell in a Flying Saucer. The relationship between conventional Christian and paranormal beliefs in the United States, and that's by Mencken et al. So this particular study looks at three different hypotheses to determine if there is a relationship between supernatural and paranormal beliefs and religious beliefs. And religious beliefs can also be termed supernatural beliefs, right? So the first hypothesis that the group came up with is there is a negative relationship between conventional Christian and paranormal beliefs. And that would be because Christianity discourages these beliefs. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The second hypothesis is that there is a positive relationship between conventional Christian and paranormal or supernatural beliefs. And that would be because believing in one kind of supernatural would make it easier to believe in other kinds of supernatural, right? And then the third hypothesis was that religious tension will have a moderating effect on the compatibility of conventional Christian, and paranormal belief systems. All right. So if you read through this study, you're going to find that hypothesis 3 seems to be the most reflective of what they actually found. And they found that there are some denominations of Christianity, primarily evangelical Christians, who distance themselves from paranormal beliefs. And those who attend church or are more religious are more likely to disbelieve in the paranormal. All right. And the feeling, so he reports that the feeling is that going to church regularly reinforces the truth of Christian beliefs while reinforcing the deceit of paranormal beliefs. For example, and I'll give you an example of this, I often have students who will tell me that they don't believe in ghosts. And they don't believe in those because they tell me they're religious, and they believe that when a person dies, their soul is judged. They go to heaven, they go to hell. It happens immediately. There's not time for that soul to linger around doing whatever ghosts do on earth. So, I'm sure that I have skeptics, and I'm sure that I have folks that are in that tradition of disbelief who are going to call that irrational, because believing in an afterlife is just as much a supernatural belief as believing in ghosts. But remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, reasonable is not always rational, right? So for people that had mainstream Christian views or who were less religious, they were more likely to have paranormal beliefs. And so these tend to be folks who are willing to engage with a lot of different types of beliefs, both secular beliefs and sacred. And they will at least usually hear believers out when the ideologies differ, even though they don't embrace the beliefs personally. So this might be a person who is a Christian, may not attend church regularly, but perhaps has friends who have different faith traditions. For example, they may have friends who are Hindu. They may have friends who are Islamic. They may have friends who are Jewish, and so they are aware of the different belief traditions that are out there. And while they may not embrace those belief traditions, they're willing to hear folks out. Often these are folks that will believe in some type of afterlife, but maybe they don't exactly know what it is. They may believe in heaven, but not in hell. They may believe in some type of afterlife, but maybe not a heaven or a hell, maybe something closer to reincarnation. They may believe that when people die, their souls aren't immediately judged, that they sort of wait around until an appointed time, which wouldn't cancel out the belief in ghosts in the same way. So in their mind, not knowing the outcome, excuse me, in their mind, not knowing the outcome definitively may make them find ghosts to be a much more reasonable proposition, right? Um, so, what can we take away from that discussion? Um, and so, like I said, folks that tend to fall into a disbelief tradition, or, my more skeptical folks, I love you guys. So this is not a knock on you. It is perfectly okay with me, and it is reasonable if you do not believe in ghosts, aliens, spiritualism, pyrokinesis, telekinesis, divination, whatever it is, right? Astrology, occultism, neo-paganism, whatever we've talked about this semester. If you find that you just do not believe in that, that is perfectly okay. Um, but often those folks will look at all supernatural beliefs as being somewhat equal, right? If you believe in one, you believe in all, right? All of them are just as plausible. Um, so if you believe in God and things like angels, devils, and virgin births, then you are a believer in the supernatural, and things like ghosts and pyrokinesis and aliens should not be a stretch for you because you already believe in the supernatural. And if you don't believe in those things, then why on earth would you believe in anything that could be termed supernatural? And that's kind of the way that skeptics or disbelievers will often look at it. But that's not quite the case. And people are perfectly comfortable picking and choosing what supernatural beliefs that they want to believe in and what supernatural beliefs they don't. Um, they find some beliefs to be much more reasonable than other beliefs are. And often, what that has to do with is their culture. Um, and so it may be easier for, within an evangelical, strongly religious family, um, and having grown up in one of those, I will tell you that there was not room for ghosts in that unless it was the Holy Ghost. And even that was somewhat suspect. Um, and there was not a presentation of Jesus or God or the virgin birth or walking on water as being something that was supernatural. It was always presented as something that was factual. All right. And so if that is your culture, then you may not contextualize those religious beliefs as being supernatural. Um, so, like I said, what what supernatural beliefs you find to be reasonable has to do with your culture. And so I wanted to talk about this guy. There's a guy named Daniel Kahneman, and he's a psychologist at Princeton. And he won the Nobel Prize he came up with this thing called prospect theory. And he was looking particularly about the ways that people think about financial decisions. But there's some underlying architecture there about the ways that people think that I think is really interesting and maybe germane to this discussion. Um, so Kahneman thinks that our brains function on two kind of different levels. And one of those levels is the intuitive brain. And one of those levels is the conscious brain. So our intuitive brain is, I guess you would call it our reptilian brain. It is the one that takes in information and makes immediate decisions based on information it knows, narratives that it's heard. It makes the associations, and it does it instantly, like nanoseconds. It takes in information, it processes it, it pulls from storage, and it kind of makes these assumptions and things like that. So that brain recalls stories. It relates what's in front of us to those stories, and we don't even realize such a thing is going on. All right. It's also called our subconscious, right? We've called this part of our brain something for a long time. All right. And so it was thought that people would make decisions about things based on what's in their best interest, that they would weigh pros, they would weigh cons, they would decide which side was heavier, and they would go with that, right? But Kahneman says our intuitive brain, it makes all of these decisions. And our conscious brain thinks it's the only brain. And so it takes that stuff and it thinks about it, and then it makes a decision. But it isn't aware of the intuitive mind working. So um, that is one reason why why it is so difficult to get rid of biases. Particularly when we talk about equality and diversity, um, many of us grew up with biases. And even though our conscious brain knows better now, our intuitive brain can't get rid of those stories that we've heard. And so when our intuitive brain is just kind of running through and grabbing information, it doesn't filter those things out. All right. And that's why it's so difficult to get past biases that we've grown up with. It's also why culture is so deeply ingrained in us. Um, our culture is our culture is what's in those stories. It's what's in those, you know, those narratives that we've heard, those situations that we've been in, those foods that we've had, that music that we've heard. All of that is part of our culture, and all of that is stored up in our brain. All right. And so I think if we're looking at folks maybe who are from an evangelical background, you know, perhaps they have narrower stories to draw from when it comes to the supernatural. Whereas if you look at people who are perhaps religious but not regular churchgoers, or if they are willing to engage with different kinds and types of beliefs, they just have more stories in the warehouse for the intuitive brain to pull from. And so that may be why they don't dismiss out of hand, um, you know, different types of supernatural beliefs. Um, Let me find my spot in my notes here. All right. So if you're a person who grew up going to church every Sunday like I was, then you've heard narratives about God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and angels and devils and walking on water and miracle and virgin births and uh, you know, all kinds of water to wine, all kinds of miracles. Like you've grown up hearing those narratives, and maybe you didn't get other narratives. So when you have certain narratives that are ingrained in your intuitive brain, and your conscious mind accepts those and disregards other supernatural beliefs. Or maybe you were exposed to a lot of different supernatural narratives, including religious ones, but not exclusively. And so your intuitive brain has more stuff to pull from, which makes your conscious mind more open to supernatural beliefs than others who are less inclined to believe. All right. And for folks who grew up in traditions of disbelief, it may just be that they didn't get those supernatural narratives, and they don't really have those in the wheelhouse. All right. And it is also entirely possible that your conscious mind has made the decision that you're just going to filter those things out. They're not filtered out entirely, at least according to Kahneman, but we certainly can decide to give them less weight. All right. Which is the reason why, even though we may have biases in our intuitive mind, we don't feel the need to act on them, behave that way, talk that way, whatever. Right. But this idea would also make sense why, as DeWan says, that narratives about alien abduction often seem so similar. So for a long time, there's been this idea that there's a socially acceptable way to talk about these experiences, and that's the type of grammar that people use when they talk about it. Remember when we talked about ghosts and we talk about the ways that people tell ghost stories? And when people tell ghost stories or personal experience stories about ghosts, they tend to start usually the same way. You're going to think this is crazy, but, or you're probably not going to believe this, but, right? within your culture, you kind of know there's an expectation of the reaction that you're going to get. There's a way to talk about these things that's okay, and there are other ways that aren't acceptable. So that's the reason that stories tend to be the same. Our intuitive mind has kind of taken in these stories and the structure that they're supposed to use, the components that they're supposed to have. And so when we tell our stories, they resemble them, right? Um, and that seems to be the case with many of these core supernatural experiences. Again, there may be differences between cultures, but the differences within culture is the stories within a culture are minimal, right? And I think maybe Kahneman's idea of our intuitive brain and our conscious brain has something to do with that. Um, because there are lots of people, who um, will accept some types of supernatural beliefs and not other types of supernatural beliefs. They may believe in uh, ghosts, but they don't believe in divination or astrology or phrenology or palmistry, right? So I think there is something to this idea that, first of all, the more kind of narratives that you heard, the more open you are to different types of beliefs. Um, the more likely you are to kind of embrace some of those beliefs. And I think there's also something to this idea that we have socially acceptable ways to talk about things, um, and that when people tell these stories, they are fitting them into this kind of socially acceptable model that they have, and don't even necessarily realize they're doing it because that's what the intuitive brain is doing, or the subconscious is doing, or whatever you want to call that. All right. So, if we look at both of these articles together, I think the takeaway here is that you don't necessarily have to believe, you just have to believe that they believe. And then you can work from there. So, that is our lecture for this week on our first lecture on aliens. We'll have another one next week. Please do watch the X-Files episode that I posted in our assignments for this week. And have a great rest of the week, and I will talk to you again soon.